We're here with the 10 greatest modern horror classics. Sinister was one of those surprises that came from nowhere. We all had our reservations when the name Ethan Hawke cropped up, but what follows a pretty intense intro is a tale of all-out twisted mental horror. There aren't many of those kicking nowadays. It's a welcome change from all the low-grade gornography we've got used to. Pontypool is impossible to describe. It's kind of like the most insane take on an infectious disease-driven apocalypse you're ever going to see. Definitely bewildering, full of jump moments, and absolutely nuts. It's proper fun too, you won't get bored. Eden Lake got a lot of stick for the scenario it sets up, but it pretty much nails violent yob gang dynamic and turns it loose on Michael Fassbender's face. It isn't really a physical horror film, it's a mental horror that slowly gets externalized by sheer violence and terror developed in the moment, all within a very lifelike and believable world for most British viewers. Definitely worth a watch. France has always been king of compelling cinema, there's no argument about it, but right now they're making waves in a genre you wouldn't expect, given their penchant for quirk and realism. Frontiers is a brutal tirade with underlying messages of anti-fascism. It's like The Hills Have Eyes meets The Descent, dialed up to 11, with a good dollop of scathing social commentary and gore in there for good measure. The Sacrament may not be your conventional Halloween horror, but it doesn't need to be. It's still bewildering and terrifying in its own way. Based loosely around the Jonestown Massacre, the film looks at outsiders who are faced with a murderous cult set on picking them off one by one for disturbing their way of life. It's shockingly plausible and maybe a little close to Red State, but if you let that slide and just go with it, you'll have an awesome time. The original Silent House from 2010 may be in Spanish, so yeah, you've got to watch a dub or read subtitles, but it's totally worth it. The whole film is shot to appear as one continuous take from start to finish. It gets going and it just keeps mounting. Of course, if you stop listening at Spanish, there is a Hollywood remake in lovely familiar English, albeit at the cost of quality and scares. No horror list would feel right without a Raimi film, would it? Drag Me to Hell popped up a few years back and it proved the director still had the chops despite 10 years of Spider-Man chewing up his life. It's great, but it doesn't take itself too seriously. It's got that something about it that we haven't had in horror since the 80s, and partnered with the awesome story, it's well worth checking out. If you haven't seen Rec or Rec 2, then you're missing out. They're genuinely two of the most terrifying films that have ever been made. Also, the fact that the second picks up 15 minutes after the end of the first makes it perfect double feature material. Yes, again, it's Spanish, but seriously, while they remade it and twisted it into the Quarantine series in the US, you want to avoid them. Rec runs circles around Quarantine. Found footage films will never be this terrifying again. The Conjuring is another recent horror that just puts a lot of its peers to shame. It doesn't rely on over-the-top CG or insanely cliched premises to get its job done. In fact, it just sinks its teeth in and it takes you for a ride through a true horror experience. If you haven't seen it, you need to get it watched. Finally, in 2011, Kill List rocked up to the party out of nowhere. We can't tell you too much about it because we don't want to give the game away, but what we can say is that it'll leave you absolutely reeling. Kill List is easily one of the greatest films Britain's put out in the last 10 years, and to call it just a horror simply wouldn't be doing it justice. When you get to the end of it, having chewed your fingers bloody, screaming at the screen, you'll certainly agree with us.